And then, again, Blair quoted in Liz Davis's Through the Looking Glass, Blair talking to the NEC, again trying to say, we don't want to have these sort of radical demands coming from the workers or the workers' representatives. You will have a ready ear in the media to attack the Labour government, but I will tell the Labour Party where that leads. It leads to 20 years of Tory government. So we have to toe the line, otherwise we'll get the Conservatives. Now moving to virtually the present. This is 2008, and the Department for Work and Pensions green paper, they published last year, where they decided that the way that you help lone parents with the way that you help lone parents is basically you send them off to work. So helping more lone parents into work will reduce child poverty. From 2010, lone parents whose youngest child is 7 or over will, where they can, be required to look for paid work. Those able to work will move on to job seekers allowance and be covered by its conditions, and this will ensure that they get the support they need to help move into employment and provide better life chances for themselves and their families. And then coming right to the very present, Mandelson's claim that he is beyond anger at the striking postal workers, presumably because that goes against our interests. So to try now to answer the question, I think there's 3 things I want to say. Where is the Labour Party going, which is the title of the talk. Based on this, I would argue, where's the Labour Party going? 3 things. 1, fortunately, workers are increasingly refusing to buy this line that the Labour Party has been putting out for over 100 years now, leading to both voter and member exit. If we look at electoral performance, the way I look at it actually is electoral performance, but particularly in terms of voter turnout as well. If we look at the share of the total electorate who are supporting the Labour Party, then that is down now to a level of 21% of the total electorate, compared to 28% in 1979, when obviously they had a massive defeat. So first of all, the Labour Party is losing both members and voters. Secondly, the Labour Party is not going to go back to old Labour. With the British capitalist economy looking at a predicted 11.4% government deficit and debt currently at around 60% of GDP and predicted to rise even higher, alongside sluggish demand, a prolonged recession and rising unemployment, is going to require fundamental and massive intensification of exploitation in order for new opportunities for profitable investment to be created. In the light of that need that capitalism has for even further exploitation, there isn't, I would argue, going to be a turn to old Labour values within such a context. And then thirdly and finally, to answer the question, where is the Labour Party going? What we're likely to see from the Labour Party, I would argue, is more of the same. More moves to intensify exploitation, more attempts to cut back on welfare provisions, more attempts to keep wages low, and more attempts to make workers more productive, less rebellious, and more disciplined. And all of this will be sold to us with the line that it's in our best interests.
Thank you. Speaker is Andrew.
Well, moving swiftly on. Right, Andrew Fisher, I'm the Secretary of the LRC. I should also say, speaking in a personal capacity. Labour governments don't really have a very good record of dealing with economic crises. And if we look at 1931, 1979 and today, each have decided that it's the working class that should pay for the crisis. The electoral result in 1931 and in 1979 was to put Labour out of power for a generation, because understandably people do realise that it's not in our interest to vote for our own demise, and they don't. So looked at from an historical perspective, Labour's going to lose the next election. Looked at from pretty much any perspective, I would say Labour's going to lose the next election. It has every time it's behaved like this in an economic crisis. Even in 1931 though, Labour's share of the vote didn't slip below 30% of the electorate. It was reduced to just 46 MPs, but its share of the vote was over 30%. At the 2010 general election, as we expect it to be now, Labour's share of the vote could well dip below 30%, as it did pretty spectacularly earlier this year. In 2009 in the local elections, it polled under 25%, and in the European elections, well under 20%. And it's worth bearing in mind it was only 36%, in fact just under 36% of the vote in the last general election. And as David pointed out, that's about 21-22% of the actual eligible voters. I think also it's worth pointing out that Labour could lose office in arguably a worse state than in 1931. That may sound a slightly controversial thing to say, but if you look at membership of the Labour Party, it's down to pretty much similar level that it was in the late 20s, 150,000, and it's dropping at the moment. That's a third of what it was in 1997. It's lost 300,000 members since that point. That's less than 300 members on average per constituency, and bearing in mind some constituencies in London still have over 500 or even 1,000 members in a couple. There's large swathes of the country where the Labour Party just doesn't exist as a force on the ground. That means it's no longer got the capacity to be a viable political force. It's also worth bearing in mind that in 1931 it was the unions that stepped in and saved the Labour Party from destruction. They pretty much took over the party to a large extent in the 30s, and it's also worth bearing in mind that they had the advantage of a good bit of propaganda. They owned the Daily Herald at the time, the trade unions, which was by 1933 the largest newspaper in circulation in Britain, with over 2 million readers. That's not really the case today, that we have a favourable media for even remotely left politics, let alone what today's Labour Party politics are. Today, so also another thing to bear in mind in comparing those two eras is that both 31 and 79 saw a significant shift internally within the Labour Party to the left in the wake of those election results. Is that likely post-2010? Foundations of the left today, more broadly, in the Labour movement in general, I think are weaker than at any time for a century, as David suggested in his contribution. Post-1979, the left drew its strength from a strong trade union movement of over 12 million members. It's about half that today, which had the right to take solidarity action. They, as well as being a much larger trade union movement, also had greater membership density in workplaces. It not only had more legal powers, but also more workers were covered by collective agreements and had stronger pay bargaining. And it was not only more potentially powerful, it was also a lot more militant. There was a lot more class consciousness. We've got to remember this is the trade union movement that brought down the governments of Heath and Callaghan in the 70s. This trade union movement inevitably fed into the Labour Party at the time in the grassroots, and have fueled a level of class consciousness in Britain probably unparalleled at any other point, arguably, in the 20th century. It's given expression in a number of left-wing councils in local government through the 80s, from the GLC, Lambeth, Liverpool, and a few others. Thatcher, though, understood the source of these powers, and this is where we see, Tony Benn quoted it at the LRC conference a couple of weeks ago. Thatcher's greatest achievement, when she was asked what that was, she said New Labour, and she's quite right. She understood the Labour movement better than most Labour politicians ever have. She understood where it derived its power from, and so she took away that power, trade union rights, and not only the removal of the anti-union laws. We saw mass unemployment, the wholesale destruction of the industrial sector, which was the strong trade union base, privatisation, and of course the anti-union laws, as I mentioned. She also abolished the GLC in London, which was a thorn in her side, and systematically removed powers from local government, centralising them to her own in Westminster. New Labour's not changed any of that. If Gordon Brown had a sense of humour, he'd be restoring trade union rights now and restoring powers to local government, because that would give at least the Tories one hell of a potential source of problems. In that's not going to happen. Is there any real chance of a left turn after the election then? No, basically. New Labour's attempted to destroy the Labour Party is even a potential vehicle for social advance. Some would argue it already has. It's pretty much there. Internal democracy has been pretty much ripped up within the party, and any sort of level of dissent has been crushed. And as the membership figures reflect, many, and mostly on the left, have left. Parliamentary elections are stitched up, they're abused, they're centralised. An NEC panel now approves them, even if local parties do have the audacity to elect their own people. And at the next election, 10 of the MPs who did nominate John McDonnell for leader in 2007 are going to retire. 2 have already left. One's left Labour and is standing as an independent, and one's left Parliament altogether as well, so that's 12 of them gone. Several other rebellious and leftish MPs, you could say, are also going to be retiring at the next election, and many others, many more, are at risk of losing their seats. The only question left, therefore, is whether New Labour will turn to the left in opposition to the Tories' agenda, a turn that might cause people to identify with Labour again, yet the current policies don't bode well. both parties are advocating cuts, pay freezes and privatisation as the solution to this crisis.